What's up, my healthy friends? It's you, it's me, it's Anna hanging out here on this episode. But before we roll out the red carpet for this fabulous woman, I want to let you know that in 2024, it's my mission to coach 500 people to get control of their sugar cravings and sugar binges so they can stop yo-yo dieting, stop obsessing about food, and finally create a body that they feel confident being in. Now, we have exercise physiologist and mindset expert UNNA GOLDSWORTHY here with me today. UNNA is many things, including a repeat guest featuring on episode 269 and 307, and now this one. And I'm just going to dive straight into it. Welcome back. What's going on?
Hi, Matty. What's
How are
going
you?
on? Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm good.
Yeah.
I've just heavy in the world of hustling, but balancing, what does it take to hustle, but also remain sane and healthy? And yeah, that's my world at the moment.
What does hustle mean to you?
Hustle to me means laser focused.
Yep.
Laser focused, like perseverance and clarity on what I'm doing so I don't get pulled in different directions.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of grit in there, but not grit gone wrong.
What is grit gone wrong? What does that look like?
I think grit gone wrong is when people don't get themselves particularly well. So they're, saying yes a bit too much, or, there's something busier happening over in one domain of life, but I haven't pulled back on another domain of life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, grit gone wrong. I guess everyone would think of it at the moment as burnout.
Which, as I know, has been coming up a lot in your world lately.
Yeah, it's coming up a lot. There's a bit of the post-COVID world. It's like the new version of POTS as well, that trigger, which was previously in my clinic world. I work with people with POTS, adolescents and young adults in particular.
Yep.
And the previous viral triggers seem to be a little bit going away, whereas now it's POTS that's been triggered by COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of fits into that whole nervous system support, muscles for nervous system, not muscles for the beach.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
Muscles for your nervous system, not muscles for the beach. When you say that, what do you mean? Because I guess most people would think, in their mind, muscles and nervous system to be separate, although we probably mostly know that it's all one giant connection. But what do you mean by that?
So our muscles go because our nervous system tells them to. So if we divide our nervous system into the two parts that get talked about a lot, being the flight and fright system, this one and it gets put the bit of drama behind it, like, don't use it too much. But we really need to understand that it's a good system.
Mm-hmm.
It's just when we live in the emotional stress or psychological stress side of that system too much and don't give ourselves those huge breaks that we need from that, the brain to body connection from the nervous system then has an impact on our muscles just on a day-to-day level, what they feel like, our fascia, can we relax at the end of the day to go to sleep? And then there's the idea that the nervous system from a fight or flight tells us to go. It helps us to move. It helps us to go faster. And a lot of our health benefits come when we go fast and we choose to do difficult things and feel a bit of discomfort. So we regulate our nervous system, the fright and flight system, by doing hard and uncomfortable things. But the challenge becomes when those stresses aren't particularly well balanced. When they look at, there's two interesting studies where they look at monks and stress levels.
Yeah.
And there's another interesting one where they look at Navy SEALs. So when they look at monks and emotional stress, and this would lean into the parasympathetic, I've kind of jumped over the calm part of our system that allows us to digest and do all those things. And the monks would be akin to that. When they give a monk a physical stressor, they have exactly the same emotional stress that we do, but when it's over, their stresses come down. back to a level of parasympathetic that says, yep, you're done, that stress is over. But the parallel people that are doing that don't have that, amazing skill of managing the mind and breath work and all those kinds of things, the stressor carries on. They're sort of looking and trying to predict in a way that maintains levels of stress in the body. And that's kind of like, if we think of it as a window of tolerance, it's narrowing that window of tolerance, how quick we are to jump into sympathetic when it's maybe not a nervous system drive that's required. And then similarly with the Navy SEALs, this idea that they train themselves so effectively, and we get amazing activation through things they're called myokines when our muscles work, that travel around our body and make our organs healthy, but particularly they travel into the mind as well and impact that the level of stress that we have in repeat emotional stresses after are less when we've pushed ourselves to high sympathetic or fight or flight tone. And those Navy SEALs also, they go to that level of stress that's required, but once it's done, the level of stress drops back down and we're back in that neutral zone again. So muscles are like, it's a way for us to train our system from a biological, physiological level. And then we kind of, our head and our mindset comes into play from the psychological about how we impact our nervous system, which then sort of floats over to choices that we make as well, whether we choose to use our muscles or not to the level that we should be to give ourselves that reliable body and strong mind. Yeah, so switching on our nervous system or thinking about our muscles in that way, I find it personally a much more longevity-based conversation rather than, oh, it's coming up to summer, I better work on the size of my muscles.
The thing that I think about when it comes to conversations around nervous system activation and fundamentally stress is I'm always torn, and I don't know if you've experienced this, I'm torn between increasing the window of tolerance versus there is just too much stimulation. Because if we think about in this example, or you talked about the studies, but I'm going to take it to an example, monks, they get to go back to a place where there's no stimulation, right? And I understand it takes training, and I'm not minimizing that at all. But if we compare the monk that's like, all right, stress is over, go back to the temple where there's nothing bad and it's all just in my head, and I get to sit down for 14 hours and it's amazing, versus let's say the Navy SEAL and or the mum with 4 kids that's trying to do a career and navigate her partner in her life. The Navy SEAL goes, let's say in this example, back into the war zone, right? And so it's overstimulation. And so I'm always torn between we need a bigger window of tolerance and need to get stronger versus we need to just chill out a bit more.
Yeah, I get that's a perfect example, and I get where you're going. But I would imagine it would be so interesting. I feel blank on, my mind wants to wander and think about the monk scenario more, because when we look at health, we see that balance of, what do our muscles need to do in intensity to gather that health span rather than a lifespan. But when I think of the war zone concept, that kind of makes me go, I feel like that over time would break someone down. And that the things that we can manage from a capacity level would chip away at us, and that's not a place that we could stay. Whereas my impression of the monks is that's a place we could stay and remain healthy. And then the mum with the 4 kids trying to juggle it all, that's where we land in the burnout game, particularly with females. There's a higher percentage of females, and I had a little look at the UK 2024 Burnout report, and I can read for you because my memory with numbers is horrible.
Read away. That women are even more susceptible to burnout, with 93% experiencing extreme stress compared to 88% of men. Yeah, and I think the numbers at the moment in general are still sitting at about 62% of
people in workforces are saying they're under significant stress and potentially even more than the previous year.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Do you think over courses of generations, we have gotten stronger or weaker in the idea, and maybe weak is a bit of a judgmental word, but less capacity or more capacity to deal with stress? And I say that because I'm a millennial. Are you a millennial?
I've got to look at the dates. I think I just line in.
Yeah, so
I'm
we're the
older
first
than
generation of snowflakes, basically, right?
I'm on the border. I hung out with the ones before, so I think I end up in this weird place. And I would like to say, as a country kid, that I've got a bit of that in me as well.
Yeah, well, I feel a bit the same. I grew up as a country kid, right? And I
Yeah.
feel like country kids are just a bit tougher than city kids. But I wonder, like, are we getting stronger, or are we losing capacity? And is it because it almost feels like all of this research and all of this study and all of this introspection, which is arguably what monks have been doing for
Yeah.
tens of thousands of years. It's like it's highlighting all these labels and problems that we don't have the capacity to properly address because we're not in the monk environment.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it is interesting. Is it like if we swang all the way back to our parents' generations,
Mm-hmm.
we talk about the challenges of lack of mental and emotional connection with parent figures, and then
Mm-hmm.
the roughness of that generation having to get through, and that mental toughness versus like it is interesting. I do think we have a fear of stress
Mm-hmm.
and that we need to get stress back into context, and that if we look at the genome of a human, it actually requires a level of stress. I would say that self-awareness needs to come into play with that, because there's, to your point, so many more stimulus and overwhelm coming from outside, that how do we figure out what is the level that we can work to, where we feel our health, our connection to our values, a connection to what matters is in scope, and that we can have, more like a wave approach to stress rather than we're climbing a hill and we will get to the top no matter what.
Yeah.
And in training or in sports, we call this periodization, so that the wave approach slowly takes us to where we need to be, but we don't generally apply that in life concepts. But when we look at that hunter-gatherer genome, which hasn't changed, for 45,000 years, and that expects and demands us to move and have stress in our life to maintain that healthy genetic representation in our body, then we start to see where this fear of stress becomes a problem for that exact experience. Is we need stress, but we need stress within our own context. The email that comes through and that sits on your mind for 7 days because the person hasn't replied, or was my reply good enough? Like it's that little micro stresses where we don't get to let go, and that psychoneuroimmunology kind of interplay where the stressor was good, but I haven't put it down. Yeah. So I think we're a bit too scared of stress, physically, mentally, emotionally, and we've got to learn how to have that relationship with stress again. And that's, the Goldilocks effects of it all, really. We need the phrase hormesis. So we want not enough stress is problematic for us. Too much stress is problematic for us. So how do we have a relationship with ourselves and our health that lands us in the middle, and we can kind of swing along that spectrum and make reasonable decisions, and also that are purposeful, deliberate, and also know when we've gone off track. So yeah, getting right into stresses is, I think that's where, what was the word you thought was a bit judgy? We've become a bit weak on stresses.
Yeah. But I'm also I feel very drawn to this resurgence of traditional masculinity. So like there's a big part of me that's like, yeah, don't be a weak little bitch. Like, you know, like maybe not as extreme as David Goggins, but I feel very attracted to the idea that, yeah, I acknowledge that modern society has weakened me, and I'm okay with that word because it motivates me.
Yeah.
But I can understand why other people would be like offended by that word, no?
Yeah, it's such a tricky juggle. I know my movement schedule and my partner's movement schedule has recently just dropped right off because our work life has completely changed. He's a drafty and a tradie on tools, so he's gone back to doing more on tools. So our schedule has completely changed.
Yeah.
So to my point that I coach people around is, how does your health fit in with your life? And at the moment, we haven't fully recalibrated into that. And I'm losing my fitness and capacity, more and more that goes on. So we've got to kind of figure out how to recalibrate, because life's not the same every day. Yeah. Figure out our philosophy about how we're going about it. Yeah. And then work into what do those stresses look like that feel good to us? What's that motivating dialogue that feels right on what matters to us? And yeah, regaining whatever character description it is for you to be mentally, physically, emotionally capable to do the things in your life that you want to do.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a lack of context that people give in that self-awareness, which results in us giving a disproportionate amount of attention, value, and stress to the email from the colleague that you don't really know? Like, what do you think's going on there for us adding all of this extra stress to something that, you know, in its own situation, in isolation, it's not that stressful and it's kind of meaningless?
Yeah.
And one way that I think about this, and I don't know if this resonates with you, is that in the transition from us going to, you know, caring about being hungry, caring about finding a mate, caring about these primal parts of ourself, that we kind of have, and I'm sort of using quotation marks, we've got autoimmune disease of the mind. And if we think about allergies of children, and often, you know, new parents that alcohol their kids' hands every 5 seconds, it's common knowledge generally in my world that kid is going to have allergies, right? Because the hygiene hypothesis says if the immune system's bored, it's got to find work to do. And I'm, you know, throwing around some general terms. But I think about that with the mind, and it's that now we're not dealing with real meaningful problems to do with our biology. The mind is now giving disproportionate weight and care and value and stress to really meaningless things, because our food is provided for so much so that we have problems with overeating, you know, and it's easy to find a mate because, you know, sexual values have changed and apps exist. And so I wonder if, what the lack of context is, or what context we can add to put these things back in proportion.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? Because we're, in theory, the richest we've ever been. Life's as easy as it's ever been. We've got things at our fingertips, yet we're the sickest and unhappiest that we've ever been as a collective. There's two things that pop up. The case study in my mind, which I'll come back to. But I feel like it does tap into self-awareness in the sense that as much as I want to do hard things, and I say I want to do hard things and I want my body to change, that really peters down to your ability to commit to beliefs that are unhelpful, stories that you need to unlearn, and those things that are sitting in under your operating system and directing your choices. So the case study that popped into my mind as you were chatting then is a woman who was in a particularly tricky time of her life, and we were going through a little coaching period. She has a high-level job and quite a tricky job, lots of responsibility, but she feels pretty comfortable in that job. She feels very skilled, and, you know, that's not a stress. So less the email example, but more that there was this funny little loop there where we're looking at where are my stresses, where are my micro stresses. And one of her macro stresses was she had this pattern of getting a project, something landing in her email, seeing, what's required, ticking some fast wins, but then the actual thing, that the big part that needed to be done, as soon as she'd done some easy wins, she'd stop. And then inevitably 4, 5, 6, however many weeks would go by before it was due. And then she would be absolutely hitting through the roof, having to focus on it to get it done in that last little bit. And her question to herself was, how much better could I be doing this if I gave myself the full 6 weeks? What could I be delivering and achieving? So that was the question that we were trying to answer to. She wanted to kind of solve that problem and get rid of that pattern and habit. So we ended up digging down to, it was the things that she'd learnt from her father in particular, and that he was a particularly threatening figure around particular rules that he'd hung around and delivered as a kid. Mm-hmm. So we're here sitting at our respective ages, but we've still got a teenage, a toddler, a whatever version of us inside us. So it was her younger version popping up. And off what she would find herself doing was getting up, and she was working from home, so she would busy herself at home. So we eventually figured out that whenever there was something that was of that ilk to do, the feeling that sat under it was, you've got to get it perfect, and don't come to me unless it's perfect. Don't bother me unless you're done. This real military kind of approach to finishing things. So she would avoid that sort of internal experience by going off and busying herself with things that she could do easily, get rid of that discomfort, and then, we just avoid that till it's absolutely required. So I think under there is this idea that every time we have a trigger, what's the chasm that's created between your reasonable response? How long does that stressor last for? And what was behind that trigger in the first place? Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting play off on burnout as well, because a lot of the theories is, athletes can get burnout. So it's not like it's a lack of physical health. Mm-hmm. People that care deeply about their work and are passionate get burnout. So it's not about your want to do the job or that you're detached from it, but this idea that there's micro stresses constantly through our working day. And then arguably, how do we define work? What is hard work? Volunteers do hard work. Parents do hard work. At work, you do hard work. So then it just bleeds out how much mental, emotional recovery you're getting in these other places in terms of carrying that email around and not realizing that you're carrying that email around in the back of your mind for, every interaction that you're having with every other loved one, or time to put it down and be fully present while I'm talking to Matty.
Yeah. I have heard, I don't know if you've heard this, but the idea that burnout can only happen when you're living or acting out of accordance with your core values. I personally refuted that with that person at the time. But what are your thoughts on that idea?
I think it can get you there. It can I think being very closely aligned with your values allows you to understand your capacity deeply. Mm-hmm. You're better at saying no when it's uncomfortable and not carrying that stress around. You're better at saying yes. You're better at understanding that laser focus like we talked about at the start. So if we talk about managing hustle and understanding your role, I think that's where self-awareness and alignment with values plays a huge role in prevention and recovery of it, because it's certainly, by definition, it's this idea that there's excessive stressors that are beyond your capability and resources that doesn't stop. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that personal responsibility versus the at-work responsibilities of an organisation, which isn't my game.
Well, my thoughts are too that because you gave the comparison of like parents and people working and then athletes, is I think too that the stresses can come from the area of that's not of dedication, right? So it's like for the athlete, maybe the training is like fuel, sure that it physically burns them out, but they could do that for much longer than the rest of us because they love that, they're attracted to it, it lights them up. But the areas of their life that they're dragging themselves through are the work, are the relationship, are the kids, and that's they're getting sucked. Their energy is sucked, or their values are pushed in different ways from those things. But we often focus our attention on where are you spending the most time, and so it's like it could be work absolutely fuels you. The catch is that when you leave work, your energy is low, and now you've got to deal with a heap of stuff you actually aren't lit up about, you actually aren't excited about. And so it's like, how can you either delegate, outsource, or reorganize those relationships in a more helpful way?
Yeah. And I've got two stories for that one. So because in a way, what you're describing is when we first start a work role, there's a honeymoon period where there's excitement, there's novelty, I see my value, there's a connection that feels usually more, I guess, aligned with I understand my purpose here. And then often where burnout becomes problematic is the resources drop off. My job role as defined isn't panning out as it was. I'm not being rewarded for my efforts or seen or acknowledged for my efforts as much. And then it kind of works, flows into stuck, overwhelmed, exhausted, the cynicism that comes along the way through these kind of phases of burnout. So in that honeymoon period, we can potentially abandon ourselves if we don't have strong boundaries around our values or understand how we think, behave, and speak when we're aligned with our values and what that is. And it's certainly from that kind of athletic point of view, and that's where it can be more heavily psychological, and the burden is very heavy on the individual because it's not a diagnosis per se.
Yeah.
It's a syndrome, and then that puts the onus on you as a failing because, the guy next to me started at the same time, and why are they fine and I'm not? So, and the irony that we end up pushing more to kind of solve the problem in those scenarios. But we can have someone that's doing a similar job has fallen into the cynicism, and then their physiology is starting to become this nasty loop where it doesn't reinforce. When we're not in a good physiological state, we're withdrawing from activity, we're withdrawing from social, and then the tendency towards depressive moods and anxious moods start to elevate, and they are distinctly different than to burnout, and that can be kind of defined relatively easily. But this idea that we can have this person and then we give them a recovery and we put them in a job where they're in control, they're highly passionate, but they're working more hours, but they know how to balance and manage their values better.
Yeah.
It's sometimes not always the workload that happens there. And then the other example is me, because I had burnout, I would say, after the end of me shutting down my first business was due to burnout. My body was completely struggling. I had, it's not embarrassing, but it's interesting to me as a health practitioner that I got there without fully knowing. And that's a tricky thing for people as well, is you think you're just working hard, so you're meant to be tired, and that's reasonable. The exhaustion's fair. So I couldn't put body weight on. I really struggled to put body weight on. But to your point, and then I couldn't exercise as well. My immune system was out the window. It was, my stress levels were high, my anxiety was high. But my work was my happy place, and I just had shocking boundaries around how much I was doing, needing to contribute to the business in a particular way. And then the more I dug into that, the more I detached from my family life. it
Right.
didn't feel rewarding. The honeymoon was over there because I was like, you're working on the weekend. What do? You're home late and all these challenges in terms of home life, which ironically just made me feel more like staying at work.
Yeah, of course.
So it became this really nasty thing, and I needed that big slap in the face of my health completely failing to realize that I was the problem in the way I was making choices and the environment that I'd created with myself. So ironically, I was the organization and the employee at the same time.
Can relate. Thank you for sharing that, by the way.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. It was a hell of a time. It took quite a long time for me to recover.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to be able to exercise again without my immune system completely dropping out. And it was a long time, but I got there.
Yeah. Yeah, I can relate to that. And just because you've shared, I want to share too. For me in 2023, I was so burnt out. For a lot of that year, I spent like 4 hours, which is only last year, on the date of this conversation, but I spent about 4 hours a day on the couch in the afternoon. And it was going on kind of for years. And I was like, come on, you're Matty Lansdown. You run the How to Not Get Sick and Die podcast. Like, figure your shit out. And I was bouncing between is it psychological and, coaching myself and being like, what am I attached to? What's going on? And then looking into stuff like, because I'm burnt out, apparently this means I'm not very passionate or connected to the work that I'm doing. And then thinking, am I in the wrong business? Am I doing in the wrong career because I'm burnt out? And apparently if you feel amazing about it, you never get burnt out. And then I was like, okay, now maybe I'm depressed. What am I depressed about? And it took me ages to figure out what it was. And you know what it was? I moved house and everything changed in 3 days.
Yeah.
Like, that's it. I tested for mold. I still don't know. I still do not know. But I tested everything. Hormones fine, blood's fine, and then I just moved house and I felt better.
Oh, wow. That's, a lot of burnout people would like that level of recovery.
Yeah. It took me years to actually be like, okay, it's the house.
Yeah, move.
Right. Yeah. So I probably could have saved myself 2 years of, mental conversations and self-loathing and of being weak and pathetic and all of the things and not getting over my long-term relationship that had also ended in that same house and all of the other factors that go into that. But it was crazy how fast it recovered when I was like, fine, I'll move. Like, I was like, oh my God, there was just bad juju in the house.
Yeah, wild. That's it brings a point though, right? Because it is hard. It's really hard to see yourself when you're in it. And there is that, I'll be fine, until you're really not. And that depersonalization and there's another kind of element where your efficacy of, what you're passionate about starts to kind of wane back. And it doesn't feel good, does it, as a purposeful person at work?
No, you feel like a massive fraud.
Yeah. And giving that energy, you give a lot of energy when you do this style of work, and you're like, I either give it and put the mask on, and then that's exhausting, or I just can't get to that level that I know I should deliver at, and that feels unsatisfying as well. So it is a bit of a nasty loop in terms of feeling like a failure. Yeah. And we want to get people out of that as quickly as possible.
Oh, and then some of that time I was like, hey, Matty, you need to take your own emotional eating program, you dickhead.
Yeah. Give me some comfort. Give it to me quick.
Totally. But you were talking about before, like developing self-awareness, and it made me think that so I've had a couple of team members working with me for a couple of years now, one of which Channy will edit this episode. Shout out to Channy. But I get all of them, anyone that works with me for more than just a couple of weeks, to do kind of like a love languages for work test.
Yeah.
And it's really useful because I understand how they feel acknowledged and validated, knowing that I also, like to feel acknowledged and validated in particular ways. And that gives me energy, right, to be able to continue on. And it's not like I'm working for this man and he sucks and he never recognizes me, or he won't give me a pay rise, or whatever the thing is that's important to that individual. So my question to you was, what self-assessment or self-awareness tools, apart from catastrophic collapse and burnout, can people look into or use, or that you use, to help people start putting a mirror up and fully recognizing, oh, this is me, this is how I operate?
I will put a little snippet into the love language thing as well. This is a stat I learnt the other day.
Yeah.
The number of, it's testing my memory, the number of people that require sick leave for burnout, of that number, 52% of them have ADHD.
Interesting.
So fitting into the how I need to operate as a system in a work environment seems to be a significant micro stressor or macro stressor for people with ADHD. And yeah, there's a link with anxiety in there as well. And on top of that, perimenopause. So,
of course.
Yeah. So for me, my big thing is the things that I say and the things that people say. So the cynicism starts to come out a little bit more, and you hear yourself saying things that are, for want of a better phrase, more like your teenage self, like, to your partner, it'll be like, a bit sort of sad in the sense of, don't be mad at me, or don't be upset at me, or don't give up on me, like those types of things, versus the flip being more towards the blame, shame, defense, things where there's more arguments on board. There's no pressure with time. I'm tired, so I'm not emotionally available for you anymore. Yeah. So to me, it's the having that self-awareness around, again, to your point, the things that you say that don't really align with your values.
Yep.
And I love the activity of just sitting down, picking one of your core values, and even if it feels uncomfortable, what are the things that you can practice as the version of you that you want to be in 6 months' time, 10 years' time? What does that person say often, or in particular environments, that is protective of that value and the way they're seeing your boundaries and your energy?
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Think it's a big tool, and you're always encouraged to observe yourself kind of like an alien. Someone's watching you and going, well, just see how this person operates. So it's not a judgment piece. We don't get in there and then start blaming and shaming ourselves, but we do want to pause and go, okay, what do I say that leaves me stuck? And what could I move that to that's more aligned with a value that fits in with my health and fits in with me moving away from this? And some people do find that really uncomfortable. I think the easiest example is when someone gives you a compliment and we kind of wriggle around, and rather than just honoring the moment where someone's done something nice, so your response should be thank you. And that can be physically uncomfortable for people to say thank you. And also, to the point, our beautiful vagus nerve, which is parasympathetic around, but also it works with our vocal cord, is when we shoot off on this sort of stress of
deflect.
This whole kind of, can I voice myself and represent my values in that moment? So sometimes there's this wonderful little intertwine of, I notice I'm panicking. That's me abandoning myself. I'm about to abandon myself with my words.
Yeah.
What would it take for me to re-engage with myself and represent the version that I want to be?
I think, to an extension of what you've just shared in regards to deflecting compliments, is it highlights a rejection of self as well, because we're basically saying, I hold myself to a higher standard, and if you accepted me at this standard, you're an idiot because I'm shit.
Yeah. And it's such a distracting thing. It abandons the relationship. It doesn't allow you to connect with that person. Yeah, so teaching those tools of a flip or just being able to say thank you and honouring what you create, because you really do disconnect from people when you kind of fumble around and don't just take a compliment or say, oh, what made you say that?
Yeah.
How can we stay connected with that person? Because connection, well, for me, it's an important value. It's up there with the core ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And the irony is in that moment of self-rejection, you're also rejecting their kindness.
Them, yeah.
Yeah.
That's it.
0 points for building connection.
You're out. But it definitely takes practice.
Oh, it totally takes practice. That's one of the places I started for just learning to work on this myself, because I grew up, never feeling good enough, and actually still kind of leverage that in a more healthy way to push myself, because I know what I'm capable of, but also can catch myself to be like, hey, what are you doing? Why are you saying that? But one of the first things that I used was just, when I get compliments, say thank you. And just sit in it and just be like, yeah, this is great, isn't it? Amazing. Even if I know I can do better, this baby step was awesome.
Yes, the gap we were talking about before with the trigger versus I'm realizing it now. We're just narrowing that gap a little bit. We can't all wear capes, just a little step.
I'm hopefully at some point I'll graduate to being able to wear a cape.
Yeah.
I guess so. My last thought before we begin to wrap up is just more around people that are in the middle of their burnout right now, that are listening to this and they're sort of like, oh yeah, that's me. What's step one? Where can they begin to sort of start digging their way out of the hellhole that they're in with all the stimulation and all the competing priorities and that kind of thing? Where can people start?
If we're sort of in that, we're definitely in there. And there is a tool that you can assess your burnout, and it gives you burnout risk kind of likelihood and all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to check in with what is my body telling me that I haven't been listening to, and then picking your team of practitioners that you could go to from there.
Yeah.
So, for me, I couldn't put on body weight. So I needed to go to my nervous system skills, and I needed to go to my nutrition skills, and then outsource as well.
Mm-hmm.
Who can I talk to around that so that my body has enough robustness and I can control my glucose levels in that space? As we've talked about, values, so someone that can talk to you, coach you, support you through what stories need to be dismantled, what's in this space where we can narrow that gap in terms of emotional responses to triggers or stresses, and be able to let them go. So that can be it can be pretty broad, right? It can be someone like me. It can be maybe you've got a breathwork coach you worked with before, or maybe you've got a yoga person that you can go to. But I guess it's with the context of understanding that I want to feel the difference that's happening in my body, so that when stressors are coming up, I get to go, I'm having an excessive arousal or stress response to this scenario, because I can feel it in that interoception of my body. So I think in that space, we need wildly more rest. So how do you take more opportunities to create rest in your life? So, and not rest, it can be rest, like actual rest, but reduced arousal. So that can be sound, it can be, stimulus of any kind in that way.
Get rid of your phone.
Yeah, yeah. That's Matty's vote. How can we do that? And to your point, how can I see when I'm going to something to numb out, and what is another option that is more balancing on my hormones and neurotransmitters that helps me to take a nervous system break, rather than, ironically digging further into those resources. Sleep becomes really, really important. So can you sleep? What's going on with your sleep? And can we get a few more hours of sleep into your schedule? And then from an exercise point of view, if you're deep in, there's not many people that would likely be exercising heavily at that point of burnout because they are exhausted. But for those that maybe are or wondering, taking a period of time, moving away from exercise that requires high sympathetic nervous system drive, so higher intensity exercise, long volumes of exercise, and moving into things that help us to reinforce the parasympathetic nervous system more is kind of where those first things come into play. That's a little bucket of where we'd want to start to regroup and retrain the nervous system. And sometimes that can be done with a reduced workload and sometimes it can't. So that starts to dictate the pace or the expected time of feeling better.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because a lot of people, and maybe the medical model is to blame for this societal idea, but a lot of people just want the quick thing. They're like, just give me the pill, you know? And the idea that we actually have to take hours out of our week consistently for many weeks can be a little bit too much for people to think, oh, I've actually got to like do three hours a week of this thing. Like, don't you just have a video you can send me or a tablet I can take?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing that's helpful in that world is if people can get to know their ultradian rhythms, so not actually just powering through the day with constant levels of stress. And that is kind of twofold, right? Because the challenge of taking a break in work hours, our mind nags us. You could be doing this, you could be doing this, could be doing this. But from a performance and optimization point of view, the irony is that by taking that break, you can be more productive. Your capability and capacity is much higher when you sit with the discomfort and get used to having really effective breaks during the day and putting your brain, it's like taking your brain out and putting it on charge again so that you can turn up with a level of bandwidth to interact with people in a reasonable way and do your work in the most effective way possible. So that's a kind of nice little trick that we work into to figure out where we can put more parasympathetic into it. And I think it's important in terms of sleep as well, and those challenges in there. But that would be my take for people, is reach out for people in your world that can answer to those things, and it will be unique to what's happening in your body. So pause and ask your body what's screaming the loudest, and go to those people, because there'll always be, some foundation that will then lead back to, okay, let's work on this with the side note of sleep. Let's work on this with the side note of reducing micro stresses.
Yeah, great. I think that was a fantastic sort of checklist for people to begin working through. And I guess each individual can identify which feels like the biggest gap to them. But as you said, reaching out to people that can support, and you're one of those people. So where can people find you on the internet?
On the internet. My website's Anna at, annamovement.com. On LinkedIn, there's my little professional page, which is Anna Movement, and just my name for my regular page, which is Anna Goldsworthy. And then my Instagram or Facebook have the same handles, anna.movement.
Amazing. For anybody listening, which is probably thousands of people at this point, please scroll down to the show notes below, click the links, jump into Anna's world. She's amazing. Check her out on episode 269 and 307, which we've done previously on the How to Not Get Sick and Die podcast. And to wrap up another fantastic session with you, Anna, what is one piece of health information that you wish more people knew about?
Let's go with the current theme of figure out your Goldilocks range. It's not one tiny little thing, but the range that you can kind of swing to, where it's not too little, it's not too much, and bring interoception. I think we've neglected interoception as a sense. Like we've got our eyes, we've got our hearing, we've got taste, and we need to bring interoception back into the game.
Amazing. You call it the Goldilocks zone, but I think you should rebrand and trademark it as the Goldsworthy zone.
The Goldsworthy zone. I was actually nicknamed Goldilocks by a lovable sort of pseudo uncle when I was little. So I've got a connection with Goldilocks, but that doesn't help me trademark anything, does it?
Anyway, thanks for hanging out again, and we'll obviously get you back soon.
Thanks, Matty. Bye, everyone.
Bye.